and welcome to another episode of the Final Ghost podcast, where we explore the intersections of horror film and feminism. In this first series, we're bringing on special guests to dive deep into film and TV shows with witchcraft at the heart of them. I'm Anna, co-founder of the Final Ghost and your podcast host. So, you might have noticed we took a little break and came back to a worldwide pandemic. Strange times out there, and we're staying in, staying safe. We hope you are too. And more than ever before, we're watching those movies that we love and finding ways of engaging with people over the horror and witchy films that we enjoy watching, rewatching, indulging in, and talking about. In this episode, we're going to be talking about a different version of a film we've already discussed on this podcast, a contemporary take on the dance horror witch story Suspiria. Luca Guadagnino, celebrated writer-director behind such art house hits as A Bigger Splash and Call Me By Your Name, took on the challenge of remaking Dario Argento's classic a few years ago. We already discussed the original film as well as its sequel Inferno on this podcast a few episodes ago. Do check that one out. The basic premise of the 2018 Suspiria is the same. A young, naive dancer called Susie, played here by Dakota Johnson, a Guadagnino regular, arrives in late 70s Berlin to audition for the renowned Helena Marcos dance company. She quickly nabbs the lead dancer role in an upcoming performance, impressing the head of the school, Madame Blanc, played here by the most frequent of Guadagnino collaborators, Tilda Swinton. But Susie's arrival also coincides with the disappearance of another dancer. Meanwhile, an inquisitive psychotherapist and a member of the troupe uncover dark and sinister secrets as they probe the depths of the studio's hidden underground chambers. I'm joined in this episode by film critic, writer and programmer Alexandra Heller-Nicholas. A Suspiriologist, if you will, Alex published the first book on Suspiria in the English language and has written some really fascinating articles on Guadagnino's film too. For those of you who haven't seen Suspiria, be warned that we will be spoiling the film in its entirety from the start, pretty much. It's available on demand now, and it might just be the indulgent, gory dance horror that we need right now. So I do encourage you to check it out.
Beginning, she gave me things. Perfect balance, perfect sleep. Oh, she wants to get inside of me. I can feel her. Oh, she can see me.
When you dance the dance of another, you make yourself in the image of its creator.
I feel like I'm not even here yet.
Madame Blanc's incredible.
1, 2, 3.
The way she transmits her work.
You have to decide, what is it you want to be for this company?
There's more in that building than what you can see, Doctor. With dangerous people.
Alex, thank you so much for doing this. I'm very excited. Not in the least because this is the first time we've actually managed to speak, and I've been following your work for years, but also because you're probably the foremost expert on Suspiria.
A Suspiriologist. I
yes.
Like that.
Yeah, that's a great job title.
I'm going to take it. It's so nice to talk to you too, and more than mutual.
You wrote the, I believe, still only English language book on Argento's Suspiria, the 1977 version. Could you just introduce a little bit your history with the films? I'm going to refer to them in plural.
Yeah, look, we'll start with the 77 one. So I should have probably looked this up. I believe it's still the only English language book specifically on the film. Maybe somebody else has dived in and had a play And I hope so. And if you're thinking about it, I personally encourage you to do so, because we need more people writing on the same stuff to get ideas flowing and going. I'm digressing here. So I'm only human. I love Dario Argento, and I must confess that the first time that I saw Suspiria, I thought it was not a superior Argento film. I was really into Deep Red, Tenebrae, the Giallo, were very much my thing. And I revisited this a couple of years ago in an article, and I think it's largely because I know that we all worship the aesthetics of VHS, but I saw a really clapped out copy of Suspiria on video, and it was muddy. It was just really muddy. All of those beautiful jewel colors just kind of melted into this sort of murky browny khaki color. And I thought, yeah, this is cool, but I don't get it. I don't get it. And it was really only when I saw a cleaner copy of Suspiria that it was like being struck by lightning. And the reason why I wanted to, and I talk about this a lot in the book, but the reason why I wanted to write about it is because it functions in a completely different way to how we normally approach cinema. Patricia McCormack has a wonderful quote, and I'm paraphrasing here, but she talks about the radical nature of Argento's Suspiria is that it just asks us to engage with cinema in a really different way. So things like narrative and character, it demands that we put them behind things like our sensory experience, like color, sound, movement. These all take over. And so the fundamental experience of watching Suspiria is different to a lot of cinema, certainly a lot of horror cinema, and it's even really different, I think, to things like Deep Red and Tenebrae. And yeah, it's radical cinema. I do think that the Argento film is really fundamentally radical cinema. So I was, I'm not a Guadagnino fan. I think I need to say that from the outset. I've not been moved in the way other people had by his films. So the news that he was doing it, I'm not precious about remakes. I love the idea of it, and I think there's some really superb remakes, and it's got a long film history, and it's not a particularly new phenomena. And I like the idea of people rethinking the same ideas and the same material. I think from a creative perspective, it can really be quite rich and interesting. So I certainly wasn't hostile to it, but I don't think I was excited as a lot of people were about it, with it being a Guadagnino film. But I have an absolutely extraordinary friend and colleague called James Shapiro from Draft House in the US and Fantastic Fest, and he'd seen it, and he was the one that said to me, you need to watch this film. Mm-hmm. He said basically this is if Fassbinder did a horror film. It's specifically of interest to you. So coming with his stamp of approval, everybody's got that friend, that mm-hmm. one friend that's, you have to see this, and you don't even question. There's not even a conversation. Well, James is that for me. And I don't know whether I would have been so keen to see it without that personal direct reference. Mm-hmm. So I saw the North American premiere, I think it was, at Fantastic Fest in 2018.
And what was your initial experience? Because I also imagine a premiere at Fantastic Fest of that film would have been a glorious, or at least a very particular experience, because watching a film like this that carries so much baggage with horror fans must really draw a reaction from an audience.
It was really interesting. I'm obviously very biased, but I think that Fantastic Fest is the best place to see any film. There's just such a great vibe. So yeah, clearly biased. Clearly, that's not coming from an objective perspective. But I watched it. I was there with the horror jury that year, and I watched it with a fellow juror, Anya Stanley, who is a brilliant film critic. And everybody in the room, I think Anya noted it at one point, but a few other people I spoke to, it was such an interesting experience because you just couldn't read the room. You couldn't tell how people were reacting to this mm-hmm. film. And I can't think of any other movie that I've seen that had so much pressure on it in a way. And I just didn't know how people had interpreted it. I couldn't tell if people liked it or didn't like it, which is really extraordinary because, usually there's a vibe. You can kind of pick it up. And
especially with a horror film, you can sort of tell quite distinctly whether people are into it or not.
Yep, it was really... I won't say that was a blanket response, but certainly the people that I spoke to shared my feeling of that. So even when I left that night, it was like, I don't know how that went. I actually don't know what, in a broad sense of reception, I don't really have any idea of how that went. In terms of my own personal taste, I liked it a lot more than I thought I would. There are certainly elements of it that I thought weren't so strong for me personally. But I know other people who those things that didn't work for me, that they're their favorite parts. So again, I draw a line between my objective and my subjective, my taste as a person who likes horror movies, and my kind of Suspiriologist status.
What were the things that worked the most for you?
I was really it was a gift for my friend James to tell me that it was a Fassbinder film. So I went in with that very much in my head, and that was how my experience was framed. It was almost like, not even so much this is a Guadagnino film, it's like, this is a Fassbinder film. And I still, to this, rewatching the film recently, I hadn't seen it since it came out. So just rewatching it before you and I spoke, just struck so strongly by, I think the film is as much about Fassbinder's The Third Generation from 1979 as it is Dario Argento's Suspiria. I just think that those three films are in very, very heavy dialogue with each other.
And for people who may not be familiar with Fassbinder's work, what do you think are those really striking elements?
Yeah, look, obviously the setting, that sort of late 70s Berlin, is very much Fassbinder's scene. That was his world. Guadagnino and I believe his production designer who worked on the film, they both mentioned Fassbinder's and The Three Generations in particular as heavily influencing the look of the film. So if you think about Argento's Suspiria and you think about the Guadagnino one, I think the first thing, even before you get into storyline or politics or anything like that, is just the look. So that's sort of, Suspiria is, this really vivid, Luciano Tovoli, these beautiful jewel colors, these extraordinary Technicolor film work. It's like looking through a kaleidoscope. It's gorgeous. Whereas the Guadagnino is totally, comparatively, it's really desaturated. All the colors almost sucked out of it. And that aesthetic is very much not just in terms of production design, but also in terms of cinematography. It just looks like a Fassbinder film. It's cut like a Fassbinder film. And then, you get very specifically into the more kind of political aspect of it. So, the stuff with Guadagnino and the time, the German autumn, the things that were going on in the world at that time, which I'm sure I'll come back to more, because I do think that what Fassbinder was talking about and what Guadagnino was talking about in this film are very locked in. I think that they're very, very tightly. I think that the Three Generations, the Fassbinder film, is way more explicitly an influence on Guadagnino's film than has been publicly acknowledged. The 6 acts. The Three Generations starts with a title screen that says, a comedy about parlor games in 6 parts, full of suspense, excitement, and logic, cruelty and madness, just like the fairy tales we tell children to help them prepare for death through the changes of life. That kind of applies exactly to Suspiria. Take comedy out and put in horror, and it's the same. 6 acts, fairy tales, 6-act witches. Ooh.
And I know you mentioned that you're not a fan of Guadagnino yourself.
And it's not a criticism. It just doesn't gel with my taste set.
He doesn't do it for you. That's absolutely fine. But how do you think he made use of horror? Because I know there's sometimes reservations about sort of non-genre filmmakers sort of going into the scene and taking over properties or remaking or even experimenting in a genre that can be quite protective.
Yeah, I really don't hold with that. I kind of I'm very strongly of the mind that we want. Yeah, it's a playground. Horror is a playground. It's a carnival.
Yeah,
we want people playing in the muck of bodies and blood and gunk. Yeah, we want the more people that we have playing with it, then the more. Even if it sucks, we just want different people playing with it. So I welcome it. I really, really welcome it. I think for me personally, where the film falls down is where it adheres to more traditional ideas of what horror is. I think that the stuff about the film that's more interesting and radical to me is where it really stamps its own signature on the kind of subject matter in question. And I think a lot of that has to do with David Kajanic. Is that, if I pronounce his name right? David Kajanic, the screenwriter.
Mm-hmm. I think that's correct.
Yeah, my apologies to David if I pronounce your surname right. I think of this as much as I think of it as a Guadagnino Kajanic collaboration. I think that David Kajanic's stamp on this film is really super important.
I mean, one of the things that really struck me about Guadagnino's Suspiria is the fact that it delves a lot deeper, it seems, into the mythology that was set up by Argento. In the trilogy of in his witch trilogy, and not just in the Suspiria film. So, what did you make about kind of this expanded universe that we encounter? You know, the dance school where we actually do see dancing, the history, the dynamic between the witches and the coven, the political background. There's just so much going on in this one.
I see the original Argento film as a palette that artists can use to make their own work. And I guess I'll come back to that more deeply in a moment. But when I think of what Guadagnino and Kajanic have done with the 2018 Suspiria, I think of as, in a way, we can draw lines between what Kathy Acker, the author Kathy Acker, did in 1993. She wrote a experimental novel called My Mother Demonology, and there's a chapter in that called Clit City, which is basically her reimagining of Suspiria. She was a huge Argento fan. She dedicates that chapter to Argento, but she kind of uses it as her source material, and then she just Kathy Ackerifies it in the same way I think that Guadagnino and Janicify it. Janicify is a really hard word to say. I don't know why I did that to myself. So yeah, they've kind of taken this source material and it's sparked something with them. And, you know, this kind of really, this setup of, you know, the girls' school and the witches, and it's given them the place to grow something that's very much their own. In the same way that Argento and Dario Nicolodi did, I think, with the original material. And I think that there's more politics in the first one that's often given credit for, but it's presented in a very Argento way. One of my favorite parts, and I talk about this all the time, but I'm obsessed with it, is, you know, the famous scene with Susie arrives at the airport and it's raining and the music is saying witch, witch, and it's incredible and we're all high and it's just brilliant. When she goes out into the rain, you know, those amazing doors open and she walks out through the rain, whoosh, the scarf is swirling. I'm getting carried away. When she gets into the taxi, just behind the taxi is a row of McDonald's signs. The taxi's parked near McDonald's and there's just this row of golden M's. And it's so detached from the world that Argento's film is ostensibly set in. But later on when Susie talks to Udo Kier, Jessica Harper talks to Udo Kier, he's not actually playing Udo Kier in the film. One of my favorite scenes in the whole film is that really unusual daylight scene where they're talking about witches. That's at the base of the BMW building. So, you know, and all the way through the film, there's this talk about, and we get this more and more in Inferno when the mythology of the three witches is established. It's about money. It's just about money. That's what drives the three mothers. It's all about economics.
It's all about greed, isn't it?
Yeah, it is, and it's present in that first one. You know, it's in this very Argento-esque kind of way. But I think that it's a conscious decision if we decide to strip away the politics. I mean, you know, there's the scene where Daniel is murdered by the dog. To defend the dog. The dog was being controlled, but the dog is a good dog. I don't want to. The dog being controlled by the witches kills the owner. I must defend the dog. But that's
we must affect all dogs. Yes,
exactly, all dogs. But that was at Königsplatz in Munich where that was filmed, which was where the Nazis would hold rallies. You know, this is not accidental. And there's, you know, you get that kind of sense from the scale of that location. So I think in a way, you know, that the original Suspiria set gave us the kind of the toolbox or the palette, and other artists have come along and used that toolbox to paint their own pictures in extraordinary ways.
One of the things that really struck me from this version of Suspiria was just how much time it spent on developing the relationship between all the characters. I mean, all the female characters, I was going to say, but, you know, most of them are women. I think there's 3 male characters in the whole of the film. So what did you make about the dynamics that are established between the coven?
I mean, I really love it, and I think it's the strength of the film. For me, the 2018 Suspiria is very much about that kind of factionalization, and I certainly am not alone on that front. But those dynamics and that politics. So you have you have the coven, and they're factionalized. They're split between the Blanc and the Marcos factions. But then you also have this split between a generational split between the coven and the students. And I love that dynamic. And I think that dynamic, again, feeds really quite, this generational question and these questions of factionalization and loyalty all locks into, and the politics of that all locks into the Fassbinder, the Three Generations film. So I think that it's more than a surface aesthetic connection to Fassbinder in this film. I think that it's arguing effectively the same thing, but in a very, very different way. One of the things I love that Guadagnino brought into the 2018 film from the original film is this. It really privileges the relationship between Sarah and Susie. And I just think that's one of the most special relationships. And it's so easy to overlook, because I think when we think of the character of Sarah, we think about her graphic death, or maiming, as it is in the Guadagnino one. It's, things don't work out great for Sarah, I think.
She does get a lot more time for us to develop a relationship with her. She's a lot more accessible in the way that she's portrayed. You can kind of her kindness seems genuine towards Susie.
And it's loyalty. And I think that that's what really drives the character of Sarah. And I think that she's such an important character. I really do. And I think that Pat Hingle as well. I really like having Pat be more than a footnote. I think that both Pat and Sarah are really, really interesting, because the thing that marks those relationships with Sarah at the core, so Sarah's friendship with Pat, Sarah's friendship with Susie, is loyalty. It's absolute devotion, absolute protection, absolute loyalty. And that's really vital. I think that that's a really fundamental heart of this film that's very easy to overlook in the world of Suspiria, in the Suspiria narrative universe, that at its heart is this really, really, really tight female friendship. It's beautiful. Doesn't end beautifully, but
no, it does not. However, the kind of the older generation that we see portrayed in a film, kind of the matriarchs, the actual coven of witches, we don't really get that sense of loyalty from them, because they always seem to be actively in competition with each other. At least the characters of Blanc and Helena Marcos. Before we even see Marcos, we get a very distinct, very overt sense of their competition with one another when everyone else needs to vote for either Marcos or Blanc. So what did you make about this exploration of a darker side of a closed off but still a society where it's only women in power, and yet that's not an idealized, harmonious, supportive relationship, at least on the side of the witches?
I think it's about generational politics as much as it's about gender politics, in that we're looking at an old guard versus a new guard. And I think the character of Madame Blanc in the 2018 film stands in the middle of that. In that and you can tell just by her age, she's not this sort of ancient, she's younger than the others, but she's older than the students, and she has the direct physical, she's in the class, she's like a bridge between these two generations. She stands between these two generations. And I think that that's really fascinating to me, because I think that we have the old guard very strongly represented by Marcos and the Marcosians. And it's this, the young people are there to be devoured. They are basically fuel to keep the old guard going. Whereas Madame Blanc that's not how she rolls. She rolls in a very different way. And her engagement in this broader generationally defined landscape is much, much more in line. She has a personal connection with her students. And we see that very much through her relationship, obviously, with Susie. There's something going on there, and we feel it, and we know where that's going to lead us by the end of the film. So I can't see the relationship between the women, as being anything but defined generationally. And the fact that it is, like, exactly as you said, the fact that they're not friends. There's loyalty there, but there's no friendship.
Mm-hmm.
And if anything, there's isolation. There's an extraordinary character who really fascinates me that I've never really quite been able to get my head around. I believe her name is Griffith or Gilbert. She's the young. She's not young, but she's younger than Helena Marcos. But she's the teacher who slashes her own throat at the table.
Oh, Miss Griffith.
Miss Griffith.
Yeah.
She fascinates me. Like, why is that in there? What does that do? And I think that there's something really, really important about her. I think that that's very, very deliberate that she's in there. And I love that I still find it a little bit slippery. But she very much speaks about the isolation and the loneliness and the alienation that this kind of context has. And it's the opposite. You know, the way that she feels is the opposite to how Sarah and Pat and Susie feel. You know, there's not those ties. There's this total sense of disconnection.
We have to talk about Tilda Swinton, who I think carries the film. It's very much an ensemble piece, and everyone is striking in their own way. You know, the fact that you would draw out a kind of this supporting character of Miss Griffith as well as being incredibly memorable to you is testament to that. But Swinton, who's collaborated with Guadagnino in a number of his previous films, even down to his first feature film. So they've been long-term collaborators. And what did you make of her performances? And I use the plural because she plays a triple role, both as a Madame Blanc, as Helena Marcos, and as the only primary male character we have, Dr. Klemperer.
It's really, when I first saw the film, there'd been rumor that Klemperer was Swinton, but it hadn't been announced. And Jessica Harper was at Fantastic Fest for a Q&A, and somebody asked about that, and it was all a sort of inside joke. So it was one of those, like, everybody knew, but nobody had confirmed it yet.
Yep.
You just need to look at Klemperer, and of course it's Tilda Swinton.
Of course,
I think I've reached a point, and I don't think I'm alone in this, and it's certainly not meant as a critique, where Swinton is so. I mean, she's iconic in the truest sense. So when you see Tilda Swinton on screen now, it's Tilda Swinton as X character. You know, you're always struck by her presence as Tilda Swinton, which is definitely not a critique of her craft, but I think it's if anything, it's an acknowledgement of her scale. You know, the kind of iconic stature of Tilda Swinton now. And what I love about it, and obviously this locks in exactly to her relationship with Guadagnino that you've been talking about, she just looks like she's having so much fun. And I love that. That's what it's about. You know, there's something about the carnivalesque glee of making a horror film that you could just see her physically, like, soaking it in and lapping it up and just loving the pantomime of horror.
It really feels like she's given the room to expand, quite literally, in terms of just spreading her wings, being able to take up so much screen space, and the way that he frames her as well, you know, even in shots where you would imagine, oh, this is a wide shot, this is one where he needs to show us the room or what everyone else is doing, and it's just the back of her neck, and that's so much more interesting than whatever everyone else is doing in that frame. She just sucks up every single iota of attention, and I don't mean this as a criticism, it's just kind of a testament to her screen power, really, and the way that Guadagnino has a way of shooting her that seems both entirely natural and also just letting her completely take over every single scene.
It's that absolute, and it's the same with Kajanik. It's an absolute collaboration. I mean, you know, I keep talking about Guadagnino's Suspiria, but it's Guadagnino and Kajanik and Swinton's Suspiria. You know, it's a collaborative process. And she just is drawn to his eye, and his eye is drawn towards her performance. And that dynamic and that magic is witchcraft. You know, there's something of the essence of the supernatural, I think, to those kind of creative connections. I really reject the idea more broadly of muse. I hate the idea of a muse because it denies the two-way interaction that we see in a film like Suspiria. You know, she's not his muse. He is her muse. You know what I mean? There's a dynamic there. There's an energy. There's witchcraft. It's power. It's beautiful. It's exciting. And I don't think it's and I think that craft is a question. You know, technically he's a great filmmaker. Technically she's a brilliant actor. but there's something more there. And you could tell that from the complete delight that she is taking in that film. Just absolutely, just glee. It's extraordinary. I think just witnessing it as an audience is an extraordinary thing. You know, it's an extraordinary feeling.
And you mentioned the word a few times, but I think we've been skirting around it for a bit. But what did you make of the way that witchcraft was portrayed in this film?
I think it's brilliant. I one of my shadow jobs, because all film critics have shadow jobs, for many years was working on a book series about contemporary dance. So this film very much locked into one of my second passions. And one of the things I find so funny about the Argento film is how there's no dancing in it. And I just think that's hilarious. I think and the one time Susie tries to dance, she keels over. And I just think it's hilarious. And I love that he replaces, you know, traditional ballet with a choreography of death, you know, these beautifully choreographed murder scenes, these beautifully choreographed violence sort of dance scenes, really. And I love that Kajanik very much, and it was his research, and, you know, he's spoken quite vocally about this, that he approached dance in a really different way. And I think that this is what really puts the stamp on Suspiria. So he obviously looks towards Mary Widman, who's a super famous modern dancer, choreographer. I mean, if you look at things, and I think you'll find it online, I think MoMA have it online, but her 1926, there's footage from 1926 of her witch dance.
Her witch dance, yes, it is online.
Yeah, and it's incredible. Like, and he really, you know, he really took this idea from people like her and Pina Bausch, this idea of choreography as spell casting, and he just took that little kernel and just ran with it. So, you know, the amazing sequence in the film where with the jumping, the leaping,
yes,
how high can you get? That comes directly from witch dance and from Mary Wigman. But you look at Tilda Swinton in it, and I love that on one hand, she looks like Meg from Meg and Mog. You know, she looks like a kid's drawing of a witch. You know, she's got the long hair and the big all she needs is the pointy hat.
Yeah.
She's like almost like a caricature of a witch. But then you put her next to...
She's like a minimalistic version of a witch, isn't she? She's kind of...
She really is. A broomstick and a pointy hat. And, you know, it's a Victorian Halloween poster. You know, it's brilliant. But she also looks exactly like Pina Bausch. Like, they've clearly styled her on the you know, modern dance icon Pina Bausch. You know, the hair, the style of the dress, the body language. It's that the look of Madame Blanc comes directly from Pina Bausch. And, you know, the dance folk, you know, like it's so, I mean, that dance, you know, the ropes is very much a kind of consciously locked in, I think, to a lot of the traditions.
And the last scene as well, the second portion of the dance that we see, the ones were actually in the witches' lair in the underground area. It's so meticulously framed where it feels and is performed like a ritual. There's no pretense anymore of it being a modern dance performance or a choreography. This is a spell. This is literally spell casting, and they're using their bodies as tools. And most of it is shot from above as well, which makes just the combination of all of these women performing these movements so chilling and terrifying in a sense, because you don't, at least myself, I couldn't really know where to focus, but found myself really drawn in by the combination of everything, the kind of the symmetry of all of it.
And I think that that's where we start getting into this sort of more political dynamic, whereas they function as a singular organism.
Yes.
Which from a dance perspective is really interesting, but from a political perspective, that's really interesting too. We're talking about the power of unified and joined women's bodies. You know, and that's not complicated. You know, that's almost like in terms of the metaphor, that's kind of a self-sourcing pudding, you know, that women are strong and powerful when they are joined together, and they bring their power together. It's not complicated, but it's still jaw-dropping. I mean, I think it's a jaw-dropping and really radical thing to say, and to say it not verbally, but to present it in exactly the way that you described. You know, there's a visual image, seeing women move, a group of women move as one whole in the context of this film, I think is really interesting. And that, you know, clearly by the time we get to that real climax of that ritual, and it absolutely is a ritual, and that feeds back again to, you know, Bausch and Wigman, this is after the bloodletting. This is after the factionalization wars of Suspiria of 2018 have been dealt with. The Marcosians have been sorted out. So they've kind of put the internal schisms to bed. That's been those power tensions have been sorted, and now we come together as a whole, and we are unified and we are powerful.
They've taken out the dissidents, and now it's just a ruling of Mare Superiorum.
And I think it's more than just dissidents. I think it's generational, and this takes me back, and I keep going back to it. I want everybody who's seen the Argento Suspiria and the Guadagnino Suspiria to just do whatever you can to track down the Fassbinder film, because this film is so deeply locked into it, because all three really at the core share the same fundamental message, which is the young cannot be agents of change if they allow the old guard to continue to profit. Each film says that. It's all about this generational tension.
But do you think, in terms of the way that magic is portrayed in it, I found it quite interesting that it's at a certain point, and obviously this changes once you rewatch the film and you know how it ends. There is an element of transference of power from Madame Blanc
absolutely.
to Susie. And
yes, but absolutely.
It's interesting in that context, but kind of even within the framework of this supernatural elements existing, and the whole plot being, and the whole kind of maneuvering, and even Volk the dance being an elaborate scheme to get Helena Marcos a fresher, newer body so she can continue ruling. What do you think about kind of the way that the magic seems to be both contained in one person, transferable to another person, but also emanating from the group of them, from the coven? Like, I don't think a single one of these witches could be a witch individually.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I think that collaborative force is in the DNA of the film. I think that what's important here, and I'm not sure if this answers you directly, so feel free to get me back on track if I go off topic here. What is so significant in this shift from Helena Marcos to Susie is it's not just power as if you think of power as a stable, unchanging object. So it's not like a baton being passed from one to the other. In that the kind of power that Susie represents is a totally different kind of power. Mm-hmm. So it's intergenerational in a sense, in that we see power given from, or taken really, from one generation to a new generation. But the way that power is understood, the way that power is expressed, and the motivations and the understanding of what power means all change on a fundamental level by the time Susie has that. And I think there's a really interesting scene. There's a couple of little moments in this film that I just think is so fascinating that the first time you see it, you don't really click on them. But the fact that Susie very early in the film, I mean, it's 2.5 hours long, so I say early relatively, where she witnesses the older women torturing the police officers.
Yes.
She spies on them, and she's aware of this. It's like the first film, Susie's like, oh, what's the big mystery? Oh, what's the big mystery? And it's like we hear witch in the opening credits. So, it's, for Susie, it might be a mystery in the Argento film, but for us, we know, it's, and I think that the Argento one's quite funny and quite deliberately funny in that sense. But Susie's aware of what's going on. This idea of her being this victim, lamb to the slaughter, I think really changes when you revisit the film. I think that yes. Susie has perhaps more intuitive knowledge that she feels through her body, that she needs to decipher, because things that should normally be shocking to her are not shocking. So I think she's processing a lot of that quite early on in the film, perhaps not consciously, but through her body. I think it's a really embodied knowledge, and I think that witchcraft is represented in this film as an embodied power.
That's quite interesting. So do you think that, considering the twist that we learn at the end, that Susie was the mother of Size all along, that actually that's a force that's embedded in her, but that she's not aware of, that there's no design to her attraction towards the school academy, which is Madame Blanc, and kind of her lack of surprise at her own prowess, at some of the things that she sees Do you think it's just kind of her awakening as opposed to manipulating or creating
Yeah,
situations?
I don't get the feel. I mean, this is just my
Yeah, that's
feeling
your
on it,
reading.
and it really is an intuitive feeling. So I don't present this as a hard and fast argument. And I do think that in a way it's validated in the film that she has that capacity within her. It's not something that she becomes. It's more of a kind of transformation or a manifestation of something that's already there, a kind of power that's in her. And I think that, these scenes where we see her as a child, being drawn to Berlin, really, drawing on the map, this magnetic pull towards Berlin and towards New York to see the dance,
Mm-hmm.
this magnetic, and the way that Marcos, the way that Madame Blanc is really drawn, she identifies that in her very clearly. There's no way that there's not that instant connection and that instant recognition when she sees Susie dance. And I think that it's very, when you first see the film, it's like, well, she sees Susie as a potential victim, I guess, like a sacrifice. But she clearly knows that there's more to it. And I think that the relationship that grows between those two women is very much that. It's, that the relationship deepens as Susie becomes more aware, perhaps more bodily aware, but they're learning it together. We really see those two women connect and understand each other through their physicality.
One of the things that really struck me upon rewatch is this rejection of the mother, especially in this line that Helena Marcos tells Susie when they're still trying to perform the ritual of, to accept me you must reject the woman who bore you, and death to any other mother. Kind of, how do you think this, what did you make of kind of this both exploration and rejection of the idea of motherhood?
I think there's lots of different ways to come at that. So Guadagnino was very explicit before he even began making the film that he was coming to it from a very psychoanalytic viewpoint.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So clearly Freud is at play here. The kind of the monstrous mother kind of figure plays into that. There's a line in the film, again, I keep talking about these little moments that have just sort of stuck in my craw a little bit. Not because they annoy me, but because they fascinate me. But Klemperer is talking to Sarah. I think it's when they're at the cafe, although it could be somewhere else. It's in one of their intense conversations where they're talking about the potential that Pat or Patricia hasn't been captured by the witches. Maybe she's gone to fight for the underground. Maybe she's part of the Red Army. Maybe that's where she's gone. And that's the assumption that runs through the surface, that she's left them. Of course, we know different.
Mm-hmm.
But he says something along the lines of, look, whether it's Mother Blanc or Mother Meinhof, it's the same thing.
Mm-hmm.
And he's talking, of course, about Andreas Baader and Ulrich Meinhof from the West German far militant Red Army faction, the Baader-Meinhof group, who permeates this film. I mean, this film was
100%, it's palpable.
But I love that direct line, that direct, explicit line. It's like, whether it doesn't matter which mother it is, they're both mothers, and there's this idea of the fraudulent mother. And I think the idea of the fraudulent mother to me is perhaps even more interesting than the idea of the monstrous mother or the villainous mother. It's the idea of the false mother, and how biology is such a skeptical. It feeds in a really skeptical way into that equation, like the idea that, well, this is your birth mother. Mm-hmm. It's almost like, well, that's meaningless. It questions the authority of the birth mother. It questions the biological nature of motherhood, and it asks us, to kind of consider. It problematizes this question of motherhood and genuine motherhood, as opposed to fake motherhood. And there's a lot going on there with it being so explicitly tied into very, very real world phenomena like the German autumn.
I'm sort of kind of wondering about where that leaves Susie. Susie, especially in her reveal as this mother figure, and quite a merciful figure as well, especially at the end of the film. She performs quite consistent acts of mercy in both towards Pat and Sarah, but also towards Klemperer as well. She's forgiving to a degree, but I'm not sure how. I enjoyed the twist. I love the questions that it raises. I'm not quite sure how to make sense of Mother Superiorum embodied by someone like Susie.
Yep. I do think that there is I think the last half hour of the film is really interesting. And I find that people who have very strong opinions about this film in any direction, that's what we always end up talking about.
That's interesting. In what sense?
Kajanik wrote the big climax dance scene. He wrote that as bloodless, as completely bloodless. So and the kind of the blood aspect was very much Guadagnino's doing. So on in the screenplay that was not there. So you still had the dancing and the bodies and the death and the stuff, but not the actual.
You gotta have the blood.
The viscera. The viscera was the weakest part for me. And I say that as somebody really, like, I felt that the horror aspects of this film were its weakest element.
I've read that you wrote about that.
I know people that say exactly the opposite, and these, people that really, really live horror. So that's very much a taste thing, and I can't critically justify that. I think it's just a taste thing. It just didn't sit right for me. But I did like the action around it. Like, I thought that the narrative and the thematics of it worked. But for me...
So can you elaborate about what about the horror didn't quite click for you?
It just felt silly to me. It just... and that's, again, that's not a, I haven't really... I wouldn't put that in a review because I recognize that as a taste thing. But it didn't feel in keeping with... And I think a lot of the body horror stuff in this film didn't really feel true to a lot of the other stuff. And, I mean, clearly I like gore, I like blood and stuff, but it just didn't, I mean, the stuff with Olga, just the CG with Olga being all contorted and stuff, it just looked a bit silly to me. I love the conceptual stuff behind it, and that morphing and the cruelty of it. I love the conceptual stuff surrounding it, but in terms of just what it looked like, it just didn't work for me. The aesthetics, I think, just a simple aesthetic thing. But I can't, in good conscience, I just can't say that that's a criticism of the film because I don't think it's valid. I don't think it, and because I know people that feel exactly the opposite, and I understand why they do connect with it. You can't deny somebody the right to connect with something.
No, totally. I do. I do
find it really work for me, but everything else worked for me really well. So yeah, that's just a taste thing.
I do find it quite interesting in the way that we, having been talking and thinking about witches on screen in many different forms, one thing that I've found is that very often it's quite bloodless violence, the sense that it's spells, it's, manipulation, and it's not as gory as other monsters of cinema in many ways. So kind of this Suspiria going full on into over the top extreme gore to a degree, very very aestheticized. It's almost beautiful to look at. But I don't think we're that used to seeing witches on screen be so gory and so viscera heavy. So I was wondering what you thought about kind of the violence that we're presented with in that sense, where we do see a lot of contorted, graphic, very bloody violence. Because I'm thinking as well of kind of films that are quite horrific in the way that they depict witches' bodies, like Roald Dahl's The Witches, the Nicholas Roeg film, but they're still bloodless. There's almost an element of fantasy of masks to it, whereas here it feels like somebody's entrails, well, they're quite literally very often somebody's entrails are falling out or being ripped out of them. So do you have kind of any thoughts about how perhaps it is unusual for us to see witches in a film where there's quite a lot of graphic and quite bloody violence as well?
Yeah, I mean, I think you're right, and I think that it is inseparable from the broader physicality of this film. How its aesthetics, its narrative, every part of this film is tied into physicality. So the dance, we've talked a little bit about dance being about embodied power, and the flip side of that is that embodied disempowerment also has to be represented physically. So I think that there's a very neat logic to it. Does that make sense?
Yes.
So that if you want to see people disempowered, if you want to see women empowered, you see them dance. If you want to see women disempowered, you see them bleed.
Mm-hmm.
And you see them mutilated, and you see the meat hooks go in. And so I think that there's a really strong conceptual logic that shows the more visceral horror of this film as the flip side to the dance. And I do think, again, that ties into the, Argento's little play with the idea of Susie not dancing, having a film set in a ballet school that doesn't have dance in it. And he replaces that with a different kind of quote unquote ballet, this really gruesome, these beautiful, gruesome horror vignettes. So I think that there's a playfulness. Again, I keep coming back to this word playfulness with how Guadagnino's film really addresses that. So it doesn't feel random to me. I think that conceptually it feels really tight, really, really tight, in that you want to see. You don't want lack of power described to you. You don't want to see it played out in dialogue. You want to see it in bodies, the same way that you've seen power demonstrated. Flying, learning to leap, flying up, and being drawn magnetically to the floor. These kind of physical displays of what power is and what power does. And not just by gesture, but through these really big actions, these fully embodied movements. So the spectacle of it makes sense to me. It makes total sense to me.
Fantastic. I'm gonna wrap up. Is there something that you'd like me to get you to mention?
I think I've talked too much about Fassbinder, but that's okay. I do really. I know it's not a particularly easy film to find, but I do really feel that it's the third part. It's the third mother. The Fassbinder film is the third mother. If you want to really get into the heart of the Guadagnino film, the key comes from the Argento film as much as the Fassbinder. I think that the Guadagnino film's really in dialogue with these films. In its discussion of not just gender politics, and I think that the film really points us towards those kinds of discussions quite explicitly. But at the same time, I mean, a lot of reviews of this film, quite high-profile ones, it's like, well, the historical setting is just set dressing. It's really peripheral, and it doesn't really do anything with it. I feel very much the opposite. I feel very strongly that this film is very explicitly, like that line that I keep coming back to. It's like, it was either going to be Mother Marcos or Mother Meinhof, that these two figures. And I don't think that's saying, Ulrich Meinhof is a monstrous witch. I don't think that it's that kind of simple a thing, but I think that there's a line being drawn here about generational power and about what it means. And the Fassbinder is like, who are you working for? You've become empowered. Who are you going to use that power for? And that's the question I think that Susie has at the end. How are you going to use that power? Who is that power for? And Susie's answer to that is very, very different than the Helena Marcos answer. And I think that's joyful. I think it's radical, and I think it's political.
And it's very different from the answer that Blanc would have given as well if she was the one with the ultimate power. Absolutely.
And I very much see Blanc as a middle figure between those two generations. She's almost like this sort of perimenopausal figure, in between. So you have this, it's the three generations.
Yeah. And also a frustrated one.
Yeah. And I think that she recognizes her own redundance.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that that's what drives the factionalization. I think it's very much driven by that. That one side is, and just how that manifests, I think, is really, I mean, I haven't got my head around it, and I'm not sure, the things that I've really connected with in this film. I don't know whether it's me bringing it from my own perspective or whether it's coming from the film, and I love that stuff.
Mm-hmm.
But I do think that this film is really in dialogue with the Fassbinder film as much as it's in dialogue with the Argento film.
And it seems like one of those truly rare crossover horror films that has a lot to dig in from the genre side, and also could function and is layered and intentional, and speaks to other types of cinema and literature and reference points that a non-genre specific audience might also have so much to glean from it.
Oh, absolutely, absolutely. And I think just in, this sort of highbrow, lowbrow thing that we're always faced with horror, the film. Remember when there were, I think the trailer came out and everybody was talking about Oscar buzz.
Yes.
So it's going to win Oscars. So it didn't quite work out that way. That's okay. Maybe not every film needs an Oscar to be a good film, would be my very tongue-biting answer to that. But not just in terms of highbrow, lowbrow cinema. Is it an art film? Well, it's Guadagnino. It's gonna, it's got that kind of branding to it. It played at the Venice Film Festival, but also just in terms of the remake. And is it a remake? Is it a reimagining? Is it in dialogue with? It breaks down a lot of these assumptions, I think, that are really heavily drenched in these kind of taste values. So it's not just about horror; it's about the remake. It makes us think about the remake, I think, in a really different way. And I'm all for it. I'm like, I mean, Candyman's coming out soon, and I'm really, I think that's going to do similar heavy lifting on the remaking front. And I'm not saying it's going to be great or it's going to be terrible, but we saw it with Maniac. I think Maniac's a really good example.
I think this is the sort of stuff that a remake should be. Yeah, it should take the very basic notion or the very basic ideas around the film, but then expand it into whatever the filmmaker that's doing the remake or reimagining is actually concerned about. Like we've been discussing for almost an hour, the myriad of influences and collaborations and approaches that Guadagnino and his collaborators have taken that are miles away from the approach that Argento and his collaborators took to make the original Suspiria. So I love the idea that these films are talking to each other, and not one of them they're standing next to each other, and not one of them is above or below one another. They're such entirely different interpretations of the very same core ideas, which in their own right were also taken from Thomas de Quincey's ideas.
Yeah, absolutely.
So it's not like the three mothers and the notion of the three mothers, or the idea of a coven of witches or of a matriarchy has been invented by Argento or Guadagnino or anyone else.
That's exactly. I mean, Argento was looking at Snow White, the Disney Snow White, which was one of the reasons why he cast Jessica Harper, was because she looked like Snow White from the Disney cartoon, which I think is gorgeous, and I think that a remake, I used the metaphor before, but a remake is like a palette. You sort of take what you use an original text to paint a new text, and that's what genre is. That's not just even genre cinema, but that's what witchcraft mythology is. That these stories are so dynamic, whether it's in folk traditions, fairy tales, video games, movies, books, subcultural identities. There's a palette where you can take what you need to make your own thing, and that own thing might be a new work of art. It might be a new identity. The craft is brilliant like that. That's, I think, why we keep going back to the craft, because it's that idea that you can take from mythology or from a you can take that and make it your own. And that sense of empowerment, that sense of collaboration, that's where it all sort of intersects, I think.
That's fantastic. Alex, thank you so much for your time and for your brilliant insight on the film.
My pleasure. It was lovely talking to you.
And where can people find more of your work online?
I have a website, which is the bluelenses.com, and I'm on Twitter. You can find me at Suspiria Alex, unsurprisingly. That's where you can find me.
Oh, cool. Thank you so much again. And I hope we get to speak more soon.
Yeah, done.
And that's it for another episode of the Final Girls podcast. Please do rate and subscribe on iTunes, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcast. You can find out more about what we do on thefinalghost.co.uk and follow us on Twitter, Instagram and Facebook at thefinalghostuk. If you enjoyed this series, please do leave us a review on iTunes. It really helps and we'd love to know what you think. You can also get in touch with us on hello@thefinalghost.co.uk. Follow Alex on Twitter at Suspiria Alex, and I am on Anna Be Demented. Thank you for listening, and stay tuned for more witchy goodness next week.